So moving to our first session, we're very lucky to have two distinguished guests opening our conference today. We're going to have an interview with Matthew Hancock. Kamal Ahmed sends his apologies as the BBC asked him to interview the Archbishop of York today, so spiritual matters and the living wage inevitably have to take precedence. But in his place, we're delighted to welcome James Hurley, who's enterprise editor at The Times. Matthew Hancock was appointed Minister of State for Skills and Enterprise in October 2013. He's the MP for West Suffolk, and prior to being elected as an MP at the 2010 general election, he worked as an economist at the Bank of England and for the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer of the time, George Osborne. James Hurley, as I said, is the enterprise editor at The Times, where he writes about entrepreneurs and small, mid-sized and fast growth businesses. He's the former enterprise editor of the Daily and Sunday Telegraph and a former editor of Growing Business magazine. He won the Enterprise Journalist of the Year category at the Santander Media Awards in 2012. Please join me in welcoming Matthew and James.
So, Matthew, thank you for joining us this morning. I just wanted to start off with a question about mid-sized businesses in particular. We hear a lot about support for the smallest businesses, and obviously big businesses, we need no introduction in terms of their relationships with government. What are you doing specifically to support the kind of businesses that we've got in the audience today?
Well, I agree with the premise of the question, which is always the most dangerous thing for a politician to do. And the premise of the question is that support for mid-caps in particular need to focus, as well as the inevitable focus on large and the growing focus on smalls. This is an area where we need to make more progress. You know, we've had an unambiguously pro-business and a pro-enterprise policy for 4 years. We've made, I think, quite a lot of progress, some of the things that were mentioned in the introduction, especially on access to public equity markets, on AIM, on the expansion of ISAs. But there's clearly more to do. The main complaints I get, and I'd be very interested to hear if I'm wrong, are on access to finance, you know, continued difficulties in the banking sector, on access to skills. I'm also the skills minister as well as the enterprise minister. I see this as a problem that comes from success. As the labour market tightens, as unemployment falls, it's harder to find good people. That is a big challenge. I recognise that. In a sense, it's a good problem to have, but it's a problem nonetheless. The third area is on deregulation, where we've made some progress, but there's much more to do to make sure that not only that, you know, regulatory structures are simpler, but also that enforcement is proportionate and reasonable, and we're taking more action in that space too.
To take the first of your 3 points there, so access to finance, Vince Cable has been fairly vocal in terms of his criticism of banks for not getting enough credits out to small and fast-growing and mid-sized companies. Where do you stand on that, on what he famously called the dialogue of the deaf, I suppose, whether it's banks not supplying enough credit to companies or there not being enough demand among companies? What's your view on that?
I didn't know he called it the dialogue of the deaf. He's occasionally got quite a turn of phrase, hasn't he, Vince Cable? Look, I've long been a proponent of sorting out the banking system. And you know, one of the problems of over-concentration in the past has been that since the crunch, the biggest banks are small in number and cover a huge proportion of the market. Now, tackling that is obviously a big legacy problem from the crunch. But I see signs of optimism, signs that it's starting to happen. For instance, so gross lending has been on an upward trend in the last 6 months or so, and is now getting to a position of being reasonably healthy. But net lending to SMEs remains negative, because people are paying back down more. Now, that's probably because margins are increasing a bit, and so there's a bit more to pay down. But also, if you then strip out construction, which has its own specific, particular issues, and was, of course, highly leveraged, and is still working through that leverage, net lending there is positive, and the surveys are much more positive than they were. But in a sense, that's a short-term answer. I think there's a really exciting long-term agenda, which is about the use of technology to break this market open. Both in lending, whether it's peer-to-peer at the smaller end and crowdsource, but also in equity and the wider open market access to equity, and the reignition of AIM that we've seen in the last year or so. But probably the biggest single impact on this is the challenger banks and the introduction of challenger banks, banks being approved for the first time. Imagine a market, any other market. Take retail. Imagine a retail market where there hadn't been any new entrants for almost 100 years. I've flicked through the YouGov cards on your tables, and in it says that 41% of British adults own a piece of clothing from Primark, and I'm proud to say that I'm one of them. 20 years ago, Primark didn't exist, and it's had a huge and positive and disruptive impact on retail from the consumer's point of view. Banking has not had that entry, it hasn't had that innovation, and it took us quite a long time after 2010 to break open the market because of the regulatory barriers. And I pay tribute to the people at Metro Bank, actually, because they forced their way through this extremely difficult regulatory process to get approval. And the regulators learnt a huge amount about how difficult that process was. It's now much, much easier, and there's more than a dozen proposals in the pipeline coming forward. And this is a really exciting agenda that's opened up. But unfortunately, the first people through that really had to knock off the rough edges of the process. But they're starting to reach the sort of scale where they're having an impact.
Even if we start to see more competition in the banking market, another kind of structural problem, if you like, of the British economy is a huge over-reliance on debt funding from small and medium-sized companies. Why do you think that's happening, and how can we encourage more companies to use equity finance?
Well, it remains true that Britain has one of the most pro-debt tax structures in the developed world. And we've made some progress in tackling that. We've tried to tackle it by reducing the tax burden on equity side rather than on putting it up on the debt side for obvious reasons and the sensitivity of debt finance, especially at this point in the cycle. So we've made some progress, but as Tony Blair might have said, a lot done, a lot more to do.
So what about some of Tim's proposals that we heard him mentioning during his opening speech then? So, for example, removing the 5% shareholding cap in terms of qualifying for entrepreneurs relief. Is that something that you'd look at?
I listened with interest. My ears perked up at that point. I mean, there's some areas where we've got a European dimension that no doubt can go into discussions about the future relationship with Europe. We pushed to expand EIS as much as possible, and we expanded it as much as the Commission would allow us to. EIS and SEIS are two hugely successful schemes. I appreciate they're at the smaller end of the QCA market, but they're hugely successful and important. So we're constantly looking at all options in this area, subject to the fact that, of course, we've still got an enormous budget deficit and money is quite hard to come by. But you've got to target the resources, your fiscal firepower. And so far, I think it's been working reasonably well, targeting the tax cuts we have been able to bring in at areas that promote investment, promote growth. Look, I come from a background in small business. One of the intro didn't mention the fact that I grew up in my family small business, and that's where I had my first job. And we went on to float on AIM, and it was that was after I'd left to forge my own path. But I've been through that process with a company that I was very close to. And so I know what it feels like, and I know all of the tensions and the challenges that you get. And of course, the more that we can do on the fiscal side, it isn't the only part of the picture by any means, but every little helps.
What was the most frustrating thing you found in that business?
Oh, undoubtedly, access to finance and late payment. So I remember very clearly a period in the early 90s recession. So I was a teenager. This was my family business. My mother and my stepfather were in the business. My stepfather wrote the software, and my mother ran the business. It was just like at home, really. She was in charge. And we had a period, whilst we were getting going, when we thought we had a pretty good product, and a big client was late in paying, and we came within a week of collapse. And we knew that if the check didn't arrive, for it was a check in those days, by the end of the week, then, everything was on the line. We employed about 30 people at the time. We felt deep responsibility for their jobs, for the company. Both of my parents, my mother and my stepfather in the business. And it wasn't the fault of our, we had a perfectly decent platform. And that period is seared across my heart. I mean, I'd grown up with the dinner table conversation being about how to grow this business, and here we were close to the edge. And eventually the check came and everything went fine. And a couple of years later, somebody invented this internet thing, and that worked really well. And things went from strength to strength. And as I say, eventually it floated. But that experience of relying on others to pay their bills on time, and through no fault of their own, this was during a recession, they couldn't. And now it gives me it feels an enormous privilege now to be the Minister for Small Businesses, taking through prompt payment issues through the House of Commons in a bill that we're publishing tomorrow. So I feel like I've come full circle.
What tangible difference to late payment will that bill make? I mean, late payment's been a problem that successive governments have promised to tackle, and if anything, the problem continues to get worse. I think it's something like £35 billion worth of payments outstanding to small and medium-sized companies.
Yeah.
And often the largest companies are the worst offenders. You see people like O2 paying on 30 days late on 180-day terms. How is your bill going to tackle that problem?
Well, the first thing that we're doing is tackling it amongst the public sector and driving good payment practice through the supply chain to the public sector. My department now pays 95% on 5 days and 98%, I think it is, on 30 days. But the business department isn't going to turn around that whole culture on its own in its direct payments, but we can lead by example. We then consulted on what all the options should be. Should we put in statutory maxima? I mean, that's a pretty heavy hammer to crack this nut. But we put that out to consultation because a lot of the small business groups in particular were asking for it. Should we say that there should be a 60-day maximum contract length? And the consultation was very clear that that's not what people were looking for. The demand was for more transparency so that there can be clarity over what payment terms can be expected as part of a contract, and then clarity over who performs well in delivering against stated terms. Because as you implied, there's two separate elements to this. One is the length of the terms, the second is paying against given terms. So there'll be clauses on strengthening transparency around payment practice for larger businesses that will be in the bill tomorrow.
Okay, and just finally, before I open up to the floor, the other element you mentioned was regulation. Can tell us what you're doing to cut red tape for businesses like the ones in the audience. And the second part to that is question: isn't it impossible for you to make a real difference to that issue, given a lot of regulation originates in Europe? I know, for instance, that was something that frustrated your predecessor.
Absolutely, we can make a difference in this space. we're on track. I can't wait till the day that we can actually say that this has been delivered. We're on track for this to be the first parliament under which the regulatory burden has fallen, not risen, in modern times. Now, measuring the regulatory burden is, of course, an imprecise art, and we do our best at it, and we've improved the way it's measured. I'll give you one story about that. When we came to office, we proposed to abolish home information packs, the information pack that was necessary in the retail property market. The regulatory assessment came back and said abolishing these information packs will be a burden on business. And the minister said, but hold on, how can this be a burden on business? We're removing a whole structure of regulation. And the answer was that it would hit the home information pack industry. And therefore, it was a hit on business. So we have improved the way that these things are measured, you'll be glad to hear. But nonetheless, the 1 in, 2 out rule has had a big impact inside Whitehall, and I see it for myself. The rule that if you want to bring in a regulation, you need to find an equivalent regulatory burden worth twice as much impact on business that you've got to remove. Now, why does this have an impact? It's because it gets under the skin of the Whitehall machine. Whitehall is very good at solving policy problems that are set out. But the first thing we had to do on entering office in this space was do an audit of what is the impact on business of all of the existing regulations, because the machine is very good at working on the current priority as opposed to assessing the stock of the burden that's there. And the 1 in, 2 out rule means that as inevitably all departments from time to time need to bring in different changes to regulation and different regulation in specific places, they all need to now go and find their outs. So there's a search for regulatory outs across Whitehall. This isn't the most glamorous business, but it's really important. So it entrenches across government and across Whitehall the need to assess your burden of regulation on business and find things that actually you don't need them to do. And so as opposed to us in the business department looking at individual regulations, we do that anyway through the Red Tape Challenge. But instead of us trying to look for specific regulations, what we're doing is we're entrenching an incentive and a culture within the departments to go and look at the burden that you're placing on business and try to reduce it. And then there's a sort of, there's this issue of whether there should be a trade in outs, because some departments have found a load of stuff they can remove, and others have regulations that they need to bring in. And so this has had a big impact by simply stating a top-line rule on the culture of Whitehall, and we're going to entrench that in law that there needs to be a target on deregulation in the bill that we're publishing tomorrow.
That's all well and good, but isn't that process somewhat undermined by the constant flow of regulation from Europe? Yeah.
Well, we have had some progress in turning around attitudes in Europe. The Barnier Commission was better than its predecessors on this front, but this is a big part of the argument that we need to make over the future relationship with Europe. And it's not an argument that we should need to make about Britain's relationship with Europe. This is about improving Europe for the whole of Europe. There is an increasingly regulatory European Commission approach is not in the interests of the whole of Europe, because we've got to compete in the global race. Now, there are an increasing number of leaders across Europe who recognize that, and we have allies who are signed up to this approach. Of course, Germany being a big one, but others too, and the new Italian government is quite strong on this agenda. So we hope that this is an area where we can make progress.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll just see if there are any questions from the floor for the Minister at all. Does anyone have a question for the Minister at all? Gentleman in the middle there on my right-hand side. Could we get a microphone over?
Hello, my name is Don Elgie. Matthew, was it just me that was a little bit confused about the terms you're putting in the budget to toughen up payments? I think a lot of people in this room would feel that as small cap companies, they become the bankers to large cap companies. What you didn't cover was the arbitrary way that a lot of large cap companies just simply alter their payment terms mid-contract, and under the guise of, well, if you don't like it, you can go somewhere else.
Yeah. I think it's fair to say that when we put out the consultation on how to tackle this, we put all of the options on the table, and then have listened very carefully to the responses. There's no doubt that this is a big issue, and it's one the government can't solve on its own. But what we can do is make it easier for it to be solved through transparency over what people do, not only in terms of their contract terms, but also how they perform against those terms, and exactly the sorts of changes that you talk about. But I think that the reason that even people like the FSB, who'd been most vociferous in arguing for action, didn't want to go towards a statutory regulatory approach to contract, is that sometimes there can be changes to contracts that work on both sides, and it would be the first significant legislative or statutory encroachment into this area, and people are very nervous about doing that. Ultimately, it's about good business practice and about keeping your supply chain in a healthy position. But I entirely, I not only do I intellectually understand your argument, I emotionally feel it as well. I get it. And we will do, I'm 100% on the side of tackling poor payment practice, and I want to do it in the way that is most practical. So we'll publish the bill tomorrow. It's got a very clear principle behind it through transparency, and as we take that bill through, I'll absolutely keep my ears open to how we can make sure that this works as well as possible.
If this is not effective, and we're still seeing the kind of practices that like the gentleman describes, for example, companies asking for rebates halfway through a contract with the implication that you have to give it to keep working with them, will you look at tougher regulation?
Well, we've followed the demands of industry and of business by taking a highly consultative approach. That's been the way that we've tackled this particular problem by putting all options on the table. Often in a government consultation, they put the option that they want and then consult on whether it's a good idea or not. Instead, we've had a broad consultation on what the whole range of options. There's another element, of course, which is about good practice and making sure that the prompt payment code is not only signed up to by more, but adhered to by more people, is a very important part of the answer as well.
I think we've got time for one more question, and then we'll wrap up. The gentleman right at the front here.
Thank you. Gavin Oldham, Share PLC and the Share Centre. Bearing in mind the number of trade sales which see entrepreneurial businesses absorbed by competitors often overseas, as transfers of business books without necessarily preserving or taking forward the employment base, do you feel that additional incentive should be given to encourage entrepreneurial share sales into listed markets, perhaps by increasing the 10 million threshold for the entrepreneurial capital gains tax where that applies? This is particularly considering that the country has invested huge amounts via the EIS schemes and so on, as you were saying earlier, and just as they're able to deliver real worth, they often get taken out, so the employment benefit is lost.
I think this is a real issue that is worth working on. The interest, I've heard it less on the employment side, because my view on the employment side is you make it as easy as possible for people to hire people, and a free labour market will perform better than if you put restrictions on the employment side. And that approach seems to be working in the jobs market, which is performing very well at the moment. But it is true that in the UK, more than in some other competitor markets, the first major sale goes into a larger business rather than open market finance. And and that instinctively to me says that you lose something because the innovation is then going into a larger organization rather than being developed to its full potential on its own. Now, who am I to say whether in any individual case that's a good idea or not? And I wouldn't want to get involved on a case-by-case basis, and I think it would be totally inappropriate to, in my shoes. But the issue of whether there are barriers to external finance, which then promotes, especially through tax incentives, unintentionally promotes that route rather than market finance, is one that we should be absolutely alive to. And as well as EIS, of course, the Entrepreneur Relief in CGT is a really important piece, and we've enhanced that. The question of whether to go further is one that has to be thought about in the round with all the other fiscal decisions. But I get the problem, and it's certainly something that's worth considering because we have a different track in the UK to many other places. It may also be tied to this problem that we've got in the UK, which is that around 80% of finance to small and medium-sized businesses comes from banks in the UK and 20% from external finance, whether that's equity or debt. In the US, it's exactly the other way around. And we regard the banks, we often revert to the discussion about the banks in the access to finance conversation as the default. There is no God-given rule that says that 80% of external finance for SMEs should come from the banks and only 20% from other sources. That is a historical situation. It is not. It's not a given. And I think that some of the exciting innovations in finance and in financial technology will help to break that open. And I think that's a change of culture that would be good for financing Britain's growing and enterprising new businesses.
Thank you, Minister. Just time for me to say thank you to the Minister, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
And look out for the bill tomorrow.
Thank you.